Crowd in, get comfortable. My pleasure to welcome Ned Markosian, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializing in metaphysics. Been there for a couple decades.
10 years.
Only 10 years. Okay. I've been teaching there for 10 years and is well known in circles of analytic metaphysics. He and I ran into each other at a conference, and we're really happy that he'd come out all the way out from Massachusetts to be with us today to talk about our bodies, ourselves, constitution, composition, the question of what we are. Obviously, a topic that many of us are interested in. So let's join and welcome Ned Markosian.
Thank you, Father Raphael Mary, for inviting me. Thank you to the Dominican School for having me, and thanks especially to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it. So the question I want to talk about today is, what are we? I think this is a really important question that everybody, every philosopher, every other person who's not a philosopher needs to have an answer to. I'm going to talk about 5 main answers to this question. The first one, I think, comes mainly from Plato, Descartes, a bunch of other people. Says that each of us is an immaterial soul, sometimes associated with a physical body. The second, I'll say more about each of these when I get to them, but the second view I'll talk about, I think, comes from Aristotle, and it's the idea that each of us, like every physical object, is a hylomorphic whole that consists of some matter having a particular form. There's also the view that I think most ordinary folk believe, which is that each of us is a compound hybrid substance with a physical part, body, and a non-physical part, an immaterial soul. A fourth view I'll talk about is the Constitution view. Lynn Rudder Baker and a bunch of other philosophers have this view that each of us is a special kind of physical object, a person, that's constituted by a different kind of physical object, a body, where you and your body differ with respect to your essential properties. In particular, you are essentially a person and your body is not essentially a person. So those are the 4 views I'll talk about, not in too much detail, before I get to the view that I will defend, which is the view that each of us is a physical body that is at any given time made of some matter, but not identical to that matter. And I'll not be giving like knockdown arguments against the views that I'm not defending. So that's good news for, I think, probably most of you hold views that I will not be defending, but you'll be knocked down. At best, you'll be given like something to think about, like, yeah, I guess that is like a cost, perhaps, of the view that I like. And then I'll say some things to try to motivate and defend and clarify the view that I do like. And that will involve saying something about a thesis, brutal existence, and its role in how I propose to answer the special composition question, which I'll tell you about when we get to it. So, okay, starting with this view that I attribute to Plato and Descartes and many others, the idea is that each of us is identical to an immaterial soul. You are your soul. You're only temporarily associated with the body, but the relation between your body and you is like the relation between your bicycle and you. It's not a genuine part of you, something that you get to steer around for a while. So that's the thing on the handout called immaterialism. It says, first of all, each of us is an immaterial soul. And secondly, a person may be temporarily associated with the physical body, but in such cases, the body is not literally a part of the person. This is my favorite view. This is the view that I hope is true. This is the view that I want to be true. For one thing, it leaves room for the possibility of an afterlife, which could be a very good thing. Or not, depending on the details. But, at least there's a chance. So you're saying there's a chance? Another thing, though, I like about immaterialism is that it makes our physical bodies less important than we might suppose, in a way that I think is satisfying. It can be a reassuring thought that, this is just a shell or something. It's not really me. It's a hard world. The physical world is a hard world. And there are many superficial aspects of having a body that are not so nice. And so it would be, I think, a good thing if all of that mattered less than many people are inclined to suppose. And there's I think, a very powerful argument for this immaterialist view from Descartes. It's a famous argument in philosophy. Sometimes it's called Descartes' argument from conception. So Descartes reckons that he can conceive of existing without his body. He does a little thought experiment. He imagines, existing as a subjective, as a conscious subject of experience, but not having his body. And that suggests to him that it's possible for him to exist without his body. But of course, it's not possible for his body to exist without his body. So by Leibniz's law, it follows that he's not identical to his body. I think that's a powerful argument. One of the better arguments in the history of philosophy. I don't think it works in the end, although it's kind of tricky to say what's wrong with it. It's easy to come up with analogous arguments that seem fallacious. And then the question is how analogous they really are and whether Descartes' argument from conception would suffer from the same problems. So think of Lois Lane could formulate an argument for the conclusion that Superman is not identical to Clark Kent, because she can imagine Superman existing without Clark Kent. Clark Kent dies. He gets cremated. She's at the memorial. Superman is there, of course, being supportive. So she can conceive of Superman existing in a scenario where Clark Kent doesn't exist, or so she thinks. And so by the same kind of reasoning as Descartes' reasoning, she would get the conclusion that Superman is not identical to Clark Kent, but he is. So there's something wrong with that reasoning. I'm not 100% sure what we should say, but maybe we should just say that if a person is, for whatever reason, unaware of the identity of X and Y, then they can mistakenly carry out this kind of argument and get to a false conclusion. Anyway, so that's why I'm not, in the end, convinced by that argument of Descartes, powerful though it is. As for why I'm not inclined to believe the view that I would like to believe, immaterialism, I think a part of it is just that I was brought up a certain way. So, sort of in my milieu, like as a kid growing up and then in college and in graduate school, people sort of encouraged me, it felt like, to be a materialist and not to think that I have a soul. I can remember my advisor in graduate school was Gary Matthews. Maybe some people know about Gary Matthews. He was one of the few teachers I've ever had who was religious and a theist, Christian, believed he had a soul. And he would tell me about, when he was in graduate school, one of his advisors was W.V. Quine. You have heard of him. And Gary Matthews told me that Quine used to say to him, "Face it, Matthews, there's only one world, and it's a physical world." So Quine was pretty down on the idea of a soul and anything immaterial. And that was sort of the general vibe that one got. So, I think I was probably influenced by that. But that's not a good philosophical reason to believe something, that it was the vibe among your teachers. You can and you should question the biases that you have that were handed down to you by your elders. I don't know if that's a controversial thing to say. A second, more substantive reason that I don't in the end accept immaterialism is that belief in the existence of souls doesn't seem to fit with our best scientific theories. So the natural sciences don't mention souls, and they seem to do a great job of explaining everything without positing souls. And I find that important, notable. A third reason is related to that second reason, and it's more personal. It's just that it seems to me that the belief that I have a soul is not supported by my evidence. So my evidence makes it seem like I have hands and body and live in a world with rocks and trees and bicycles and other creatures, many of whom are conscious like me. I think that's for similar reasons. Science doesn't posit souls because scientists are evaluating their evidence in a similar way. Main reason that I don't believe materialism. A second view, historically important, is hylomorphism. And I take it this comes from Aristotle, although I want to note that I'm not an Aristotle scholar, and I'm probably about to get some details wrong of what Aristotle says. And I believe there are some genuine Aristotle scholars right here. So I welcome corrections on my Aristotle scholarship during the Q&A. But here's a view that's at least inspired by Aristotle. It's also importantly similar to the neo-Aristotelian view that Catherine Kozlicki, a contemporary philosopher, endorses. So anyway, to be on the safe side, I'm going to call it hylomorphism rather than Aristotelian hylomorphism. Okay, so think of a lump of clay that's fashioned by a sculptor into a statue of a snowy owl. When the sculptor does their work, a new object, a statue, is brought into existence, or so it seems. It didn't used to be there, now it is. Oh, beautiful statue. Now imagine an alternative scenario in a nearby possible world where the sculptor, in a different mood that day, fashions the same lump of clay into a statue of a rabbit, as opposed to a snowy owl. In each world, it seems like a new object is brought into existence, but it also seems like the snowy owl in the one world is not identical to the rabbit in the other world, despite being made of the same matter. So they're two different statues. And this suggests that there's something more to the two statues than just the clay that they're both made of. The obvious candidate is to be the something more is the shape or the structure or the form of the resulting statues. And the natural way to fill in the picture is to say that each object has two distinct elements: the matter of which it's made, the clay, and the form that the matter instantiates. So in this view, a similar thing applies to all physical objects, including you. So you're a hylomorphic whole consisting of some matter, the matter that your body is currently made of, and a form, perhaps the form of a human. So it's on the handout, this view, hylomorphism. I hope I spelled it right. Each of us, like every physical object, is a hylomorphic whole consisting of some matter and a specific form. One problem with this view, it seems to me, is a problem of the many. So there are too many forms instantiated by this portion of matter where I'm located. Like, am I an animal? Am I a human? A man? A person? An Armenian? A philosopher? A guy from New Jersey? What determines which form is the one that combines with the matter to make up me? Relatedly, am I the only thing that's made of this portion of matter? In that case, why did that one particular form win, like the sweepstakes, and get to be the one that is the form attached to this portion of matter in order to make up a thing? Because the matter also instantiates many other forms, like the ones I mentioned. And if I'm not the only thing made of this portion of matter, then there are too many things here. We have like the skeptical problem of me not being able to know that I'm a person. Maybe I'm an animal. Maybe I'm just a guy from New Jersey, which is usually how it feels to me. Like if aliens grabbed me and, woke me up in the middle of the night, what are you anyway? I'd be like, I'm just a guy from New Jersey. Another worry I have with hylomorphism has to do with the making up operation. How is it that the matter and the form are related in such a way that they make up me? Is it a mereological relation? That's what it is for Catherine Kozlicki. But I don't know. I have a problem with that. So I have a whole view about things and stuff. And one of the key principles of my whole view, which I'm really not going to go into today, is that like the catchphrase is mereology carves ontology. And one of the things that means is that there are different ontological categories, and mereological relations do not ever obtain between members of different ontological categories. So one of the ways mereology carves ontology is it keeps the different ontological categories in silos. So you can have part-whole relations among physical objects, but not among like a physical object and a number. You don't have to believe that, but it's an important principle for me. A further problem, it seems to me, with hylomorphism has to do with grounding. So the natural way to understand the hylomorphic view is as saying that I exist in virtue of the fact that this portion of matter exists and instantiates this human, say, form. But there's a principle called ivo-entailment, in virtue of entailment, which I'll talk about more shortly. And from that principle, it follows that the existence of the matter instantiating this form should entail that I exist. If I exist in virtue of the matter instantiating this form. But I don't think that is the case. I don't think this matter instantiating this whatever form is my form entails that I exist. Maybe in 100 years, the very same matter will be the matter of a different human. That could happen. That would not be me. So those are some reasons why I don't like hylomorphism. Turning to dualism. So I think dualism is the view preferred by most ordinary folk. They want to believe that they have a body and that's a part of them, and they have a soul and that is also a part of them. So they're a kind of a hybrid compound thing. So each living person is a compound substance composed of an immaterial soul and a physical body. One classic problem with this view, which Descartes was aware of, oh, by the way, sometimes like in Intro to Philosophy, we call this Cartesian dualism or even Platonic dualism, which this is really neither here nor there for today's purposes, but I think both of those are misnomers. I think Plato, as mentioned, is a monist who thinks he's identical to his soul, maybe has a body temporarily, and same with Descartes. But anyway, dualism, the classic problem with dualism is how do the two different parts interact? It's hard to see how a physical thing could interact with a non-physical thing. But, the non-physical thing, your mind, can't like push on your brain, can't poke it, can't use electricity or anything because the mind is non-physical. One possible answer to that problem is kind of inspired by Hume, of all people. It's to say that when it comes to causal interaction, anything is possible. We cannot rule out mind-body interaction a priori, and it seems to happen. Like, look at that. So we should believe in it. That's a possible response to the interaction problem. A second problem with dualism is that, like immaterialism, there doesn't seem to be enough empirical evidence. for this view. Science does not posit souls, and my evidence seems to me not to support the belief that I have a soul. Your mileage may vary. A different problem with dualism is that a hybrid substance like this, where one part is non-physical and one part is physical, would be a strange creature. By way of comparison, suppose there's an object composed of your body and the number 7. What kind of object is that? Where is it? When is it? Why does it even exist? It would be very puzzling to me. And finally, a fourth and related problem with dualism for me is that, again, I don't believe in cross-category mereological relations. So I don't like the idea of a whole with a part that's physical and another part that's non-physical. There's a view that's very popular among philosophers. I'm calling it the material constitution view. So Lynn Rudder Baker is an example of a philosopher who develops this view. The idea is that each of us is a special kind of physical object, a person, that's constituted by a different kind of physical object, a body, where the person and the body are distinct from one another. So just as a statue can be constituted by a lump of clay, where the statue and the lump of clay, so now I'm not talking about the clay, which would be some stuff or some matter. I'm talking about the lump of clay, which is a thing, an object. But arguably, the lump of clay and the statue are not the same thing. After all, they have different temporal properties. The statue is newer. Different modal properties. The lump of clay can survive being squashed, but the statue cannot. So it seems plausible to say that there's two things there. And one of them is, Baker and others like to say, constituted by the other one. So that view is meant to accommodate the natural thought that when I die, I will go out of existence. I, the person, Ned, will go out of existence, but my body will not go out of existence. So that's the material constitution view. It says each one of us is a special kind of physical object, a person, that is constituted by a different kind of physical object, a body. Constitution is a sui generis relation between distinct things. One objection that comes to mind for many people is there can't be two objects in the same location at the same time, like me and my body, or even the statue and the lump of clay. The standard response by proponents of this constitution view is to say, it's two objects of two different kinds, so it's okay. But myself and many others feel like it's not okay. Because maybe they're two different kinds in the sense that one's a statue and one is a lump of clay, or one is a person and one is a body, but they're both physical objects. And that's what's not allowed is two physical objects in the same place at the same kind, in the same place at the same time. There's another standard objection, though, to the material constitution view, which is the grounding problem. So the person and the body are composed of all the same particles. So what grounds the differences in their modal and temporal properties? Supposedly the person and the body have different modal properties and different temporal properties. Also, why is the one object composed of those particles a person and the other thing is a mere body? Again, their parts are exactly the same, arranged in exactly the same way. So it seems a little bit miraculous that somehow the person has these modal properties, these temporal properties, and the body has other modal and temporal properties. A third, I think, non-standard objection to this view is that there's a skeptical worry. So since they're composed of the same particles arranged in the same way, my body and I both have what it takes to be conscious on this material constitution view. So presumably they are both conscious. So presumably they're both thinking thoughts, like I am a person. But one of them is wrong about that. How do I know I'm not the one who's wrong about that? Okay, so that was like sort of a quick survey of some views that I don't like. Here's the view, well, one of them I do like, but I don't believe, sadly. Here's the view that I do believe, the person-body identity. So all of the above considerations lead me to the conclusion that I am a physical object that's identical to my body. That is, I am my body. That is, my body and I are like one and the same. Our bodies, ourselves. That's why I stole that title. So the view, the person-body identity view, says each one of us is identical to their body. You're identical to your body. I'm identical to my body. An initial immediate problem that comes to mind is, but what about the natural thought that when I die, I will go out of existence, but my body will not go out of existence? What can a proponent of the identity view say about that? I think the best thing to say is that contrary to the natural thought, it's in fact true that I will survive my death. That's the good news. The bad news is that I will be dead. But I'll continue to exist after dying. So, and that's the sense in which I'll survive my death. I think what's in fact likely to happen is that at some point shortly before I die, I'll go from being a living conscious person to being a living thing that is no longer conscious, and irreversibly so. At that point, I'll no longer be a person. So I'll lose that property too, but I'll still be alive. And then sometime around then, I'll die so that the thing that was formerly alive, formerly conscious, and formerly a person is no longer any of those things, but it will still exist in the form of a corpse. One reason I think we should say that the thing that is me will continue to exist after I die is that we should say similar things about many other living things when they die. Trees, plants, insects, rabbits, cells, strands of hair. They all seem to be best described as objects that survive their deaths, in the sense that they continue to exist as dead things after dying. So it would make sense to say the same thing about ourselves. Okay, so far so good, maybe. So I'm saying I'm identical to my body and I'm located right over here in this human-shaped region. But now we could wonder which collection of particles in this vicinity is the one that composes me. There are too many good candidates. So apparently the number of particles that make up a human body is something like 10 to the 27th power. So I guess that's 27 decimal places. I mean, not decimal places, places before the decimal. It's a lot. It's a really big number. And you could have various collections that consist of like almost all of those great many particles minus one, minus this one, minus that one. Or like add one that wasn't included in the original huge number, but from like the periphery somewhere. So there are too many collections of particles that are good candidates to be the collection of particles that compose my body. This is the problem of the many. It's a problem discussed in metaphysics literature. The problem of the many is mainly a problem for those who accept universalism as an answer to the special composition question. So let's try to get clear on what the special composition question is and what universalism is. First, here's a definition of what it means to say that some things compose a further thing. So this is an important mereological notion that has to do with the parts that compose a whole. Like the whole could be the table, and the parts could be big macroscopic parts like the legs and the tabletop, or they could be all the tiny parts like the molecules, or even smaller ones like the particles. So the definition, which comes from Peter Van Inwagen, is on the handout. Some X's, that is, some things, some group of things, some plurality of things, compose Y, some object, means the X's do not overlap, and each one of the X's is part of Y, and every part of Y overlaps at least one of the X's. To overlap is to share a part, to have a part in common. So the X's compose Y when the X's are all disjoint from one another. There's no overlap. And together, they are the parts of the bigger thing. And there are no other parts of the bigger thing that are not included in those X's. That's what it means to say some X's compose something Y. And then an important question that Van Inwagen asked after introducing this notion of composition is the special composition question, which asks, under what circumstances do several objects compose a further object? That's like a standard way to ask the question. So, some X's compose a further object if and only if what? What should we put in that blank? And really what we're after is not just a biconditional, a statement of necessary and sufficient conditions. As in most philosophical discussions, what we're really after is an in virtue of story. So we want to know, this is the second way that I phrased the special composition question. In a case of composition, in virtue of what is it true that the relevant X's compose a further object? What makes it true? What's the metaphysical explanation for these parts composing a table? That's the special composition question. Turns out to be surprisingly difficult to give a satisfying answer to it. Probably the majority view endorse this, what I take to be unsatisfying answer, which is called universalism. So the idea behind universalism is the X's don't have to do anything to compose a further object. Just by existing, they automatically compose a further object. So any collection of objects automatically has a whole. So the way to say it is necessarily for any X's, there's a Y composed of those X's, if and only if the X's do not overlap. The do not overlap is just because of the definition of composition, which had built into it that some X's compose something only if the X's do not overlap. So as long as some X's don't overlap, they automatically compose something. Like all the chairs around the table, they automatically compose something. But if the table, like if there was a part of the table that was 3/4 of it and another part of it that was like the right half, the left 3/4 and the right half, they would overlap a lot in the middle. So they wouldn't count as composing something just by definition. So what universalism is saying is as long as some X's are not ruled out from composing by definition because some two of them overlap, they automatically compose something. So like all of our bodies plus the Eiffel Tower, there's an object composed of that group of objects, according to universalism. I brought it up because it should be clear that universalism generates the problem of the many that I mentioned before. According to universalism, every collection of particles in my vicinity is such that its members compose something, which means that there are a gazillion different human-sized objects in my immediate vicinity. So what's needed to avoid the problem of the many is an alternative answer to the special composition question. Luckily, I have one right here in my back pocket. In order to explain my answer to the special composition question, I need to tell you about my account of parthood. So composition, as you just saw, is defined in terms of parthood. The mereological primitive in the definition of composition that I just read is parthood, like X is a part of Y, or overlap. Overlap means having a common part. And in fact, all the mereological terms that are used in discussions of the metaphysics of mereology in the literature take parthood to be primitive and then are defined in terms of parthood. So the first question we should be asking about the metaphysics of mereology is not the special composition question. It makes more sense that the first question we should ask is what makes it the case that some object is a part of some other object? We should ask about parthood. So this is what I'm calling a question about parthood, or quap. Oh, quap. Under what circumstances is one object a part of another object? That is, because as usual, what we really want is an in virtue of story. For any x and y, if x is a part of y, then in virtue of what is that the case? What's the metaphysical explanation for x being a part of y? If my hand is a part of my body, why is that? What makes it true that my hand is a part of my body? The most natural thing to say about this is that some object x will be a part of another object y in virtue of occupying a subregion of the region occupied by y. So there's a region of space that my body occupies, and there's a region that my hand occupies, and the region occupied by my hand is a part of the region occupied by my body. That's why my hand is a part of my body. That glass over there occupies a different region that's not a part of the region occupied by my body. That's why that glass is not a part of my body. I won't argue for it here, but this, did I just read the subregion theory of parthood?
I think you explained it. So you didn't read it.
Okay, yeah, I blanked out for a second there. Okay, so this is the subregion theory of parthood. It says for any x and for any y, x is a part of y if and only if the region occupied by x is a subregion of the region occupied by y. That's the statement of the view in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. As an in virtue of story, it's the second part. That is, if x is a part of y, then that is true in virtue of the fact that x occupies a subregion of the region occupied by y. I'm not going to argue for STP here, but it strikes me as the most intuitive of any answer to any of the questions metaphysicians have been asking about mereological phenomena in the last 35 years. In fact, the only real objections to STP are all based on the possibility of two or more objects being co-located in the same region of space at the same time. Because if that could happen, then we might want to say that one of them is a part of some other whole, but the other one is not a part of that whole. Like if it's a ghost particle that's just passing through your body, not being a part of your body, then that would be a problem for STP. But I, for one, am very happy to insist for independent reasons that this kind of co-location is metaphysically impossible. One of the things about physical objects, as opposed to, say, abstract objects, is that you can't have more than one of them in a single place at a single time. This is just a metaphysical principle about physical objects. They can't be co-located. They jealously guard the regions of space that they occupy. Okay, so I'm very happy in theory of parthood. It seems sort of like intuitive. I would even say obvious. And luckily, it can play a central role in answering a bunch of other mereological questions. So I'll get to that in a second. But first of all, considering the subregion theory of parthood, which mentions the regions occupied by different objects, makes the following question seem very salient. This is a question about spatial locations, or quasal. In virtue of what does each physical object occupy the region of space that it occupies? So like you occupy a certain region of space right now. Why is that? What makes it true that you occupy that region as opposed to some other region? Mind you, this is not a question about a causal explanation for your being where you are. There's a causal explanation which has to do with like, the movement of your body as you walked to a place and then sat down in a seat. That's the causal explanation. This is asking about a metaphysical explanation. What makes it true? Like, is it because of, well, it's not because of the causal story, because you could be occupying some other region. It's not because of your like mass or your color or your shape or what you ate for breakfast. Like, what makes it true that you occupy this region rather than that region? And as far as I can tell, there are really only two plausible answers to this question about spatial location. The first one is to say that it's brutal. It's brutal location. There's no true and informative answer to quassel for any object X and region R. If X occupies R, then it's a brute fact that X occupies R, not in virtue of anything else. That's one possible answer. The only other intuitive answer, I think, is moderately brutal location, which says for any object X and region R, if X is a mereological simple that occupies R, then it's a brute fact that X occupies R. And if X is a composite object, not a mereological simple that occupies R, then it does so in virtue of the fact that R is the fusion of the regions occupied by the simples that compose X. In other words, composite objects inherit their locations from the mereological simples, the partless atoms that compose them. And mereological simples themselves just have their locations as a brute fact. There are two reasons to reject moderately brutal location. Sounds kind of good at first, maybe, you know, it's the moderate view. But it's like moderate Democrats. It's really not the best. So here's two reasons why moderately brutal location is not the best. One reason and the other one is an excellent reason. So the good reason is that moderately brutal location is inconsistent with the possibility of atomless gunk. You might have heard about atomless gunk. Atomless gunk is when you have an object that has parts and every part also has parts. It's parts all the way down. You never get to a mereological simple. Each part has other smaller parts, and they have smaller parts, and they have smaller parts. David Lewis calls this atomless gunk. I have independent reasons for not believing in the possibility of atomless gunk, but many philosophers do believe in the possibility of atomless gunk. And I think they have to reject moderately brutal location, because moderately brutal location requires that there be some simples. That's the good reason for rejecting moderately brutal location. The excellent reason is that moderately brutal location is also inconsistent with the subregion theory of parthood, which I love so much and which I suggested is like the obvious intuitive view that everybody should believe about parthood. The reason has to do with if you accept both the subregion theory of parthood and moderately brutal location, then you're going to have a circularity problem. I won't go into the details here, but if you want to ask during the Q&A, please do. So I think we should reject moderately brutal location, which means accepting brutal location. Between the subregion theory of parthood and brutal location, we're almost in a position to have a satisfying commonsensical answer to the special composition question. All that's missing is one final ingredient, which is a particular answer to the following important but neglected question, a question about existence. Okay? Which asks, in the case of each physical object X that exists, in virtue of what is it the case that X exists? So this is, again, not asking for a causal explanation for the existence of X, but what grounds the existence of X? In virtue of what is it true that X exists? Seems to me that like like spatial location, existence has got to be either fundamental or very close to being fundamental. So I take it that there are two plausible answers to K. One is brutal existence, which says there is no true and informative answer to K. For any X, X's instantiation of existence is a brute fact. And the other one is moderately brutal existence, which says if X is a mereological simple, then the existence of X is a brute fact. But if X is a mereological composite, then the existence of X is in virtue of the existence of the simples together with their doing whatever the correct answer to the special composition question says, some symbols have to do in order to compose a whole. Like just existing if universalism is true, or being such that their activity constitutes a life, if Peter Van Inwagen's answer is right, etc. But you know me, so you know I don't like this moderate view. So I have an argument for brutal existence over moderately brutal existence. And it starts with what I take to be a true principle about the in virtue of relation. So this is the principle Ivo entailment that I mentioned in passing earlier. So just some notation, we'll say like P of Fn is an expression that refers to the proposition that corresponds to some fact, Fn. So the thought is that there are facts, like your instantiation of humanity. And then there are propositions, like the proposition that you are human. And for each fact, there's a corresponding proposition. It's not the case that for every proposition, there's a corresponding fact, because as you know, there are false propositions. Okay, so this principle Ivo entailment says for any facts, F1 and F2 through Fn, if F1 obtains in virtue of F2 through Fn. So if we have a case of a fact obtaining in virtue of some other facts that are grounding it, then the conjunction of the propositions that correspond to the grounding facts logically entails the proposition corresponding to the grounded fact. That's what Ivo, in virtue of entailment, says. It's similar to another principle that many people have more recently come to accept, that's sometimes called the necessity of ground. Anyway, here's an argument that I've given, that's why it was in my back pocket, from Ivo entailment for the conclusion that existence is brutal. So consider some composite individual. At the time I first thought of this argument, my son Zane popped into my head. So consider my son Zane. He exemplifies the property existence. He has that property. But in virtue of what could that be the case? In virtue of what does he exist? What grounds his existence? If it's not brutal, then the most likely candidate is what moderately brutal existence says. Zane exemplifies existence in virtue of the fact that all of the relevant symbols exist and are arranged a certain way so that they don't overlap, if universalism is true, or so that they're fastened together, if that's the right theory of composition, or are such that their activity constitutes a life, or whatever. So because they exist and because they're arranged a certain way, that's what grounds Zane's existence. That would be the main alternative to saying that it's just a brute fact that Zane exists. But here's the thing, the conjunction of the proposition that those symbols exist and are arranged that way, even with whatever is the true answer to the special composition question, does not entail the singular proposition that Zane exists, that he exists. The most those other propositions could entail is that there's somebody that has features who exists. That would be a qualitative proposition. That's different from the singular proposition, he exists. For one thing, you could have the same symbols arranged in the same way without having Zane existing. Like in an eternal recurrence world, maybe in 100 billion years, things will be exactly like this again. But Zane won't exist then, like my Zane, the Zane that is in this iteration, this epicycle of the eternal recurrence world, that will be a different Zane. Or maybe just as a result of a random coincidence in 100 years even. Those same particles could come to be arranged the same way, but that wouldn't be Zane. That would be a different person. Like maybe those particles get scattered all over the Earth's biosphere in, over the next 100 or so years. And then some powerful being, just for fun, collects them and assembles them according to the blueprint that Zane, this moment, instantiates. And then presto, the same symbols would exist and be arranged the same way, but that would not be Zane. So we have to rule out moderately brutal existence, and that leaves us with brutal existence. Okay, so here's what all of this has to do with an answer to the special composition question. Imagine a very simple world that only has 4 objects. And for each object, it's got its spatial location as a brute fact. And let the table on the handout represent the facts about existence and location in this simple world. So given the subregion theory of parthood, and given the facts about location of these objects that are represented on the table, we can tell that X1 and X2 are both parts of X4, because they both occupy subregions of the region occupied by X4. So by the subregion theory of parthood, they're both parts of X4. We can also tell that X4 has no other parts, because we can tell that the region occupied by X4 doesn't overlap with any of the other regions. So we can tell that there's an object composed of X1 and X2, and we can also identify that object. It's X4. All of this information is in that table. What the toy example illustrates is that the combination of the subregion theory of parthood, brutal existence, and brutal location entails an answer to the special composition question. And the answer is what I call regionalism. So the first part of regionalism says necessarily for any x's, there's a y composed of those x's if and only if there's a region R and an object Z such that R is the fusion of the regions occupied by the x's and Z occupies R. So if you have a bunch of objects and you have a further object that occupies the region that's collectively occupied by the first bunch that you started with, then those objects compose that further object. The second way of saying this in terms of the in virtue of relation, it says for any x's, if there is a y composed of those x's, then that is the case in virtue of the fact that there is a region R and an object Z such that R is the fusion of the regions occupied by the x's and Z occupies R. Okay, so maybe that was a mouthful, but it is very much based on the subregion theory of parthood. Once you have the subregion theory of parthood, once you understand that to be a part is just to occupy a subregion of the whole, and then also if we accept brutal existence, it's just brute facts, which things exist, and brutal location, they're just brute facts about where these existing things are located, then regionalism basically just falls out of those 3 things. What does all this have to do with the problem of the many? Well, now we know, since we know regionalism is the correct answer to the special composition question, that universalism is not the correct answer to the special composition question. So we do not have to assume that each collection of particles in my vicinity is such that its members compose something. That's good news for me. It means that we don't have to assume that there's a gazillion human-sized composite objects all clustered in this small area. We can believe, as common sense suggests, that there is just one human-sized object in my vicinity. It's me. Okay, so the upshot is, I claim, we know from brutal existence that it's a brute fact that I exist. I just exist, and that's not in virtue of anything else. So I'm this human-sized thing whose existence and location are brute facts, and I'm the only such thing in my immediate vicinity. Wait, you might think, especially if you're forgetful, there have to be 2 human-sized things, a person and a body, because I will go out of existence when I die, but my body will remain. But we've already addressed that concern. I am this body, and being a person is a phase that I'm going through. Like being a graduate student was a phase that I was going through. When I die, I'll still be here, although I'll be dead. So there's no double occupancy here. It's not two things in the same place. There is a kind of double occupancy, though, involving not two things being in the same place, but a thing and some matter being in the same place. So my body, the thing that I'm saying is me, is not identical to the matter that my body is made of, even though they're both located right where I am. Here are three different quick and dirty arguments for the claim that my body is distinct from the matter that it's made of. First, the matter that my body is made of can survive some changes that my body cannot survive. Being rearranged in some radical way, for example, like being burned and then scattered in the sea, that would leave the matter still existing, but my body would have gone out of existence. Second, my body did not used to be made of this very matter, and soon it will be made of some different matter. So my body is not identical to this matter. And the third quick and dirty argument is that the matter that my body is made of has been around for millions of years, but I'm not that old. So my body occupies a region that is also occupied by the matter that constitutes my body. But this is not only not a cause for alarm, as it would be if there were two physical objects in the same place. It's in fact required by any view that distinguishes between an object and the matter that the object is made of. It would be alarming indeed if an object could occupy a region that's different from the region occupied by the matter that that object is made of. Physical objects have to be where their matter is. Anything else would be an outrage. A lot of athletes these days talk about you have to be where your feet are. This is like that. You have to be where your matter is. Okay, so the bottom line for me is I'm a physical object that's constituted by some matter. There's only one physical object where I am located, and I'm conveniently located where the matter that constitutes me is located. I'm always identical to this body for as long as I exist, but I'm constituted by different portions of matter at different times. Also, I'm currently alive and conscious and a person, but I will not always be all of those things. At some point, I will lose consciousness permanently, and soon after that, most likely, I will die, but continue to exist. Around that time, maybe sooner, I'll also cease to be a person. Eventually, after I die, pretty quickly after I die, if I'm cremated, I will go out of existence, and then that will be that. No more Ned. But I'm hoping that all of those changes will not take place for at least a little while. Thank you.
And there's plenty there. We have a few minutes I think we can use for some questions. So I will cut it off when we run out of time. But yeah, any questions?
First of all, thank you for giving me the vocabulary to say I have a brutal existence in a brutal location.
You're welcome.
Secondly, the conversation I was looking to hear was something about like capacities or characteristic activities making up a human person. So it seems to me that the reason we would posit something more immaterially about the human soul is that the human can do things like think, include, and love. And that seems different than the matter that makes it up. And so on your account of like the human person being this matter constituting a body in this particular region, where do these new properties and capacities of thought come from?
So do you mean I should solve the hard problem of consciousness?
Or is there some notion of how thought fits into your how consciousness fits into your schema so far?
So sorry, I didn't mean to be dismissive when I said that. But that is a famously hard problem in philosophy of mind. Like how to account for consciousness? How does consciousness arise? How does like the subjective experience of consciousness, of what it's like to be me, somehow arise from a bunch of particles, swarming around. But one important thing that was in your question was about the relation between the matter that constitutes me and consciousness versus my body and consciousness. So I think that the matter that constitutes me is not conscious, but the body constituted by that matter is conscious. And I think the reason for that is that consciousness involves a subjective experience. So it involves a subject. So it involves like a single thing, a unified thing that is the subject of the consciousness. That's the body. And then the matter, that's coming and going. And it's not a unified subject. So like one thing about the unified subject point is it's the same subject across time. Like I remember when I started this talk an hour ago, and now I'm answering your question. It hasn't been the same matter the whole time from an hour ago to now. Even in that short a time, there's some exchange in matter. So if there is a continued subject of consciousness, which I think there is, then it makes sense to say that it's the body that's conscious, not the matter. Does that help at all? It still doesn't solve the other question about how does a composite object made of all these many particles and neurons somehow achieve the effect of giving rise to a subjective experience of consciousness? I don't have an answer to that.
Maybe.
Even David Chalmers doesn't have an answer. Sure.
Yeah, I want to thank you also. I kind of want to go to the question of parkhood and the subregion theory of parkhood. And I'm probably way out of my swim lane, but I'm coming from physics, trying to understand the philosophy. And it seems to me that you're kind of working the quantum. And what I was wondering is if empirical, mathematical physics, for example, has any bearing on this. So for example, two things can't be in the same place. That's true for electrons, it's not true for photons. So the Pauli exclusion principle really sings well with everything you said about two things not being in the same place, but it doesn't work with photons. And then
Wait, sorry, I want to make sure I understand. First you said photons, then you said bosons.
The same thing, photon is a boson.
Okay.
So the world is two halves. there's fermions, things with, basically things that can't be in the same place at the same time. And there are things that can be. And those are photons or bosons or, but anyway.
Wait, the ones that cannot be in the same place are called fermions?
Correct.
I have heard that term. And the ones that can be in the same place, is there a word for that?
Bosons. Yeah,
Bosons.
named after Bose, Einstein and Bose.
Including, so photons are among the bosons. I see. And are they thought to be physical objects?
They're known to be physical objects. It's the whole standard model.
And are they known to have spatial locations?
Yes and no. I mean, you can measure them. So, yeah. But let me just finish the question because
Okay, I'm not trying to mess you up. I'm just trying to understand. Yeah.
Be brief. And the other part is mathematical, and that goes to, I really kept thinking set theory and Cantor, as we were speaking. And one beautiful result is the rational numbers are infinite and the irrational numbers are infinite, but they're not the same infinity. So rational numbers are countably infinite, irrationals aren't. And when I think about, not just a physical laboratory like CERN in Switzerland, but in the head where you work, even in the mathematical space, some things seem to be able to occupy the same space, like the uncountably infinite, reals also can sit on the same pin that the two angels sit on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm having a little bit of problems with your founding premise.
The subregion theory part, or this exclusion principle about objects, physical objects can't be in the same place at the same time?
The subregion theory part based on two angles. One is I'm coming at it as a particle physicist, one I'm coming at it as a mathematical physicist.
Yeah. I think that if physics finds that different objects can occupy the exact same region at the same time, that would be a problem for my view, and I would change my view. But there are probably different interpretations of the different relevant theories. So like one interpretation might be that two point-sized particles can be arbitrarily close to occupying the exact same point without literally occupying the exact same point. So that's one possible way things could go. Another way things could go is somehow to distinguish between, maybe the bosons are not physical objects. Maybe they count in some other category. You said, when I asked you, do they have spatial locations? And you said yes and no. So like, that seems like an important thing to get to the bottom of. And maybe like when one is observed in the way that Heisenberg talks about, and it then does come to have a spatial location, this could be a problem for me, because is it now going from being a non-physical object to being a physical object? I'm not sure what to say about that. I do have a different view defended elsewhere, according to which when we ask what even are physical objects, like what's the difference, what's the distinction between physical objects and non-physical objects, the best thing to say is that physical objects have spatial locations and non-physical objects don't. So that's relevant here, but that might also be messed up by the theories in physics that you're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks very much. This is fascinating. I have a lot of questions and comments. One quick comment is that I actually think there's some interesting ways in which your position could be compatible with Aristotle, but that would probably take too long, so maybe I can send you an email or something.
Please do.
But I
My email address is on the handout.
okay, perfect.
Yeah.
It's just a clarificatory question. I'm looking at this, the handout on regionalism, and maybe I'm just thinking about this the wrong way. It seems to me that part of the fact is what makes Hamilton a part of me into a unified body. And as I'm reading this, or at least as a person sitting we were talking, it seems that we have the unity as a region of my part, and not a unity of my body. You see, so is the fusion of the region, the spatial location, or is it of the parts or the whole? Or is this making sense?
Yeah, I think so. So one thing you might be picking up on is that I gave an account of when physical objects are parts of other physical objects, in terms of regions being parts of other regions. And you might think, well, that's what we were trying to get, is an account of parthood. And you just gave an account of parthood in terms of parthood. And what I want to say is I gave an account of parthood for physical objects in terms of parthood for regions.
Okay.
And one thing I didn't say, which maybe I should have, and I think you're picking up on, is I do have an account. In fact, I think regionalism requires me to say the following: when it comes to the regions of space, the correct mereology involves what's called unrestricted fusions or universalism. So there are automatically fusions of any arbitrary different regions of space. That's not true for physical objects. So you and the Eiffel Tower don't automatically have a fusion, and in fact don't have a fusion. But the region you currently occupy and the region the Eiffel Tower currently occupies, those regions do have a fusion. It's a scattered region of space. So I am presupposing what's called like a classical extensional mereology for regions of space, where you have to be point sized to count as simple and not have smaller parts. And any different collection automatically has a fusion.
That helps, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we're gonna have to leave it there, folks, but let's thank Professor.
Thank you very much.